Pre-colonization cultures were a complex set of systems, both in justice, education, and I notice that some folks are having a difficult time hearing me, so I'm bringing the mic up closer to my mouth. Thank you very much for that. My apologies. Pre-colonization cultures was a complex set of systems in education and justice, child welfare. And with colonization, that changed. With colonization came the exploitation of Indigenous peoples and also violence against Indigenous peoples. Some of the stories that you're going to hear tonight are about reconciliation, the impacts on folks and on people and communities. You're also going to hear a lot of stories about resurgence and resilience. I'm extremely excited to welcome our panel of speakers and our panel of performers, and I'm going to open up this evening inviting Aurora Finkel to the stage. Aurora Finkel is a beautiful young woman, Korean Mohawk from Taninaga in Ontario, Mohawk Territory. She has been singing and drumming since she was 9 years old, and she's going to open us up this evening, and I feel very honored to welcome you to the stage. Aurora, please, all my relations.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rochelle, for the warm welcome. And thank you very much. It's beautiful to be here, and it's beautiful to see all of these faces interested in something so important and so valuable to Canada and the world as a whole. I'd like to say a few words just before I sing. And I've been thinking a lot on reconciliation and what it means and what I think it means and what it means to our next generations and our current living situation. And I think one of the most important parts about reconciliation is the preservation of our culture. So I was thinking of some things that we can do as individuals in our own household with our own families to preserve our culture. And one of the most important things that I thought of was taking away screen time and taking your children into the forest. Taking them into the forest, teaching them hunting, harvesting. That preserves Indigenous science, Indigenous values, respect for the land, knowledge, and eventually it will also affect the next several generations. So thank you. The song I'm going to sing is called the Strong Woman Song.
Thank you, Aurora. Throughout our evening, you're going to hear messages from our speakers and through some of the performances, and some of the messages and the information are going to make reference to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, who released a report in 2015 with calls to action. So please take note of those references, and after two of the speakers, you'll have an opportunity for questions and answers, and again, our online audience will also have an opportunity to pose questions through the chat function. It's my honor to invite our next speaker to the stage. Eddy Charlie is a colleague of the Indigenous Perspectives Society. Eddy Charlie is a former student of Cooper Island Residential School, a graduate from Camosun College. He and his partner, Kristen have worked tirelessly in Victoria, organizing events for Orange Shirt Day, which draws attention to residential school. They met at Camosun College at an event, and they've been working, I think, for a few years together since. So I'm absolutely blessed to please ask Eddy and Kristen to come to the stage. Welcome.
Exquecho siem asa Kristen Spray, just lesan sanek, isan quanis itla tia an alananak. Just want to say that Eddy and I have such good feelings and warm feelings, gratitude for being invited here today and to share an important message in learning together. I grew up on the WSÁNEĆ territory. I'm English, Irish, German, and Scottish on my father's side, and English, Irish, and Scottish on my mother's side. Want to also say what a privilege it is growing up as a visitor on the Lekwungen speaking people's land of Songhees and Esquimalt Nation. In 2013, I attended the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Vancouver. I had first heard about residential school in my early 20s while in India and in an intercultural school that asked me to present on Canada's culture. And that's actually what I found out and realized. It was upon learning some of that information that I realized instead of pursuing more years in India that I would come home and learn more from the people of the land. And so that's what I did. And as I mentioned, in 2013, the journey continued when I heard and witnessed many people share about their experience in residential school, and also the children of people who had gone to residential school. It affected me deeply, and I knew I had a responsibility to do something instead of just carrying on with my life path and my vocation and job. I felt paralyzed. And so I found out about the Indigenous Studies program at Camosun College, and I enrolled in 2014. And within the first week of our program, Eddy and I were classmates. He welcomed me into the circle when I was doubting myself and feeling immense pain and guilt for what my ancestors have been a part of, and for the ways that myself and my family have benefited from the suffering of other people from the land. And so it was after hearing that Phyllis Webstad was sharing in her community about having her orange shirt taken as a small child that a number of classmates and I chatted about what we could do on campus, that something needed to be done, especially at an institution. And we only had a few days before Orange Shirt Day, and so it seemed like time had passed, but we went and we found anything orange possible. And we wrote Every Child Matters, and we had opportunity to share in a couple of our classes about residential school. Within that year, though, it just felt like we needed to do something more. And so I asked Eddy if he would consider working together to raise awareness, to have ceremony at Camosun College. And after a little bit of time, about a year, Eddy agreed to stand together and share his story. And I've been trying my best to know how to be a good friend and be of support to Eddy's courageous journey. He's an exceptional person, and he's worked really hard, walking countless miles to speak to people, politicians, business owners, people on the street about his experience, but also the ongoing experience of many people who are still affected by residential school. We had our first ceremony in 2015 at Camosun College, and by 2016, Eddy had become quite good friends with Mayor Lisa Helps, and he had written a proclamation for the city to make Orange Shirt Day, Every Child Matters, September 30th, an official day for the city of Victoria. It's quite an accomplishment, and by 2017, we had graduated, and the city agreed to have us hold ceremony within the city. And so as we walk together, as we eat together, as we struggle together and learn together, this journey is just kind of kept going. It's a story that hasn't finished, and even right now, after September, a month where Eddy and I chose to wear orange for 30 days and to talk in community, we've felt a little tired and quite emotional. And we just know it's all a part of the ongoing story, and Creator has a bigger path ahead for us. Hajka CM.
Hi. I want to say thank you to Kelly for thinking about us and inviting us to be here. I want to acknowledge that we're on the lands that the Lekwungen people call home, and I'm filled with gratitude at this opportunity to be here to share my story. And, the story of 150,000 children who were forcibly removed from their homes. This is what Kristen and I do almost every day. We talk about what happened to 150,000 children who were forcibly removed from their homes and sent to residential school. Our residential schools were created by the government and operated by the churches to assimilate Indigenous children into Western culture. Now, this is supposed to be a school where they teach children, but they weren't doing that. I often think about what it was like for people that didn't experience residential school. How do I go among them and explain to them some of these things that happened to them without putting fear into them, without creating horror? I want to be really gentle about it, but it's often very hard. I went to residential school as a very young child, and something happened to me. The very first day I went to residential school. The very first day I went to residential school, I was just a tiny little child with my siblings and my cousins. We got on a ferry to go to Cooper Island. All the little kids were on one side of the ferry, just standing there staring, some at their feet, and some were looking back at the land where they just came from, wanting to go back home instead. It's been one of the most emotional journeys for me to be here, because this is my story. This is the story of 150,000 children, including many of the people that were from my own village, children I grew up with, children who I learned how to fish with, children who I learned how to identify plants on the land with. As soon as we start going to residential school, everything that we knew was taken away from us. But that's not the worst of it. I think about this every day. 150,000 mothers who had to stand there and watch helplessly as their children were being taken away. How do you put this into words to explain to people what trauma is all about? It's not just about the children that were taken away from their home and put in a residential school. It's about every single mother who had to stand there and suffer in silence because they weren't allowed to do anything. Many of these mothers and fathers were under threat to be arrested, or in many cases, they were warned that they would never see their children again if they weren't allowed to take their children into residential school. And my parents were no different, but I didn't know that. I'm 55 years old today, and I just learned about that threat last year. When I went to the residential school with my 3 siblings, I kind of thought something was happening. Because 2 weeks before they took me away, I was taking a peek into my grandparents' window. And I saw my father, my grandmother, my mother, and my auntie standing in a circle. And they were drumming and singing. And I recognized that song they were singing. It was a mourning song. But nobody died. So I got curious and I wondered what happened. 2 weeks later, they took us into the residential school. And from that day forward, my life was changed forever. The innocent child that went into that school came out some different. My parents did not speak English very well, and my grandparents didn't speak it at all. So, as a result, many of us only spoke Hulkameetnam. That's my grandparents' language. So when we got to residential school, we became favorite targets of the priest and the dorm supervisor, and they beat us quite frequently for speaking our language. They beat us every time they caught us singing songs that my grandparents taught me. I was happy, much more happier speaking my language, drumming and singing the songs that my grandparents taught me, than I was singing Mary Had a Little Lamb. I enjoyed going up the mountains and finding medicine that could help me stay strong, a medicine that sustained my people for thousands of years. I enjoyed going up the mountain and learning about the animals that lived there. It made me much more stronger and more human than what the residential school changed me into. Well, they did beat me up, and they did call me stupid Indian. They also sexually abused many of us too. A lot of the sex abuse that happened were the really tiny children. Some of the children were there for 2 to 7 years. I was only in there for 2.5 years, but in those 2.5 years, it changed me into a fun-loving child who would do anything for his siblings, who would do anything for his grandparents or his parents. It was almost like when I came out, I burned a little bit different. then when the day I went in, a lot of anger came out with me when I came out of the residential school. And it was uncontrolled anger. People talk about intergenerational trauma. What is intergenerational trauma? People don't really know very much about it because it's basically something new. I want to try to explain in my own words what I think it is. I went to residential school like a book. Imagine a book. Many words that you learn from your grandparents. Many plants that you learn from your grandparents and your parents. All the trails that take you to the medicine. All the trails that teach you how to create the character that your grandparents want you to have. All the songs. All the culture and tradition that make you into what you are right here. That is your book. I had such a book before I went to the residential school. Now look at this book. First day in residential school. These teachers, these dorm supervisors, these priests, these nuns erased one page every day. Every day they took a piece of my history, a piece of my culture, a piece of my identity, and they erased it from the book. This is something that happened to 150,000 children. You have 150,000 books, empty pages. They all left the residential school with no hope, no reason to be. These children were the last line of defense for our culture and our tradition. They were the future and the hope for many generations to come. After that experience in residential school, that hope disappeared. I came back and I didn't know what to do anymore. I did not know how to function in the real world. So, to deal with that pain and that anger, I started drinking alcohol at a very young age. And I took out my anger on my family, my friends, and as I got older, I started taking it out on the community. I was raging. And there were 150,000 other children just like me. We were just like a forest fire that nobody could put out. When my grandparents went to residential school, my parents went to residential school, they came out, they had rules they had to follow. They had to have a tag just to go downtown to do any shopping or to get a job. But my generation, we didn't have any restrictions. We could do anything we want, and that we did. We raised hell. My generation pretty much destroyed any hope we had of preserving our culture or tradition because we were angry. I hurt a lot of people in my lifetime because of how much hurt, how much anger I had right here. I hurt people in my school, and these are non-Indigenous people. I hurt people wherever I went to work, and many of them were non-Indigenous people. These people, they judge me for that, but they also judge the other people that come from my own culture. This is the effects of intergenerational trauma. We took our anger out, not just on our beloved family members, but anybody that come into contact with us. I always ask myself, do I regret who I had become? I can't answer that. I can't tell you yes or no. I can't say I feel bad. I can't tell you because residential school took that ability away from me to know what's right, to know what's wrong, to know what's good. I spent most of my life drinking and fighting, hurting people. 21 years ago, I sobered up. And for the first time in my life, I look at my life. I try to understand what I had become. I struggle with that question every day. People always tell me, why do you guys keep talking about residential school? This is something that happened a long time ago. Because it's hurting me. It's hurting 150,000 children. Out of these 150,000 children who went to residential school, there are still 70,000 children out there. I want people to hear my story. I want people to understand that these children were really tiny. They were hurt. They did not have anybody there for them when they came out of residential school because their parents did not know how to be parents. Their grandparents did not know how to be parents. We pretty much had to raise ourselves. That's why I want to talk about it every day. I want people to know we had a name before. We had identity. We had culture before. Now we're living without it. I'm 55 years old, and I don't even want to know anything about my culture. I want to get to know my family now. We learned how to hate, and some of us still do hate. Some of my cousins do not like to talk to me. Some of my brothers and sisters still refuse to talk to me. But all across the land, I still see the effects of residential school in every community I go to. Kristen and I have been to all the reserves on this end of the island. We see the effects of residential school in the community. You see it in the alcoholism, the violence, the loss of tradition, the loss of culture. There's just a lot of extreme hatred out there. You don't see very many Indigenous people graduating out of high school because of intergenerational trauma. The effects are destroying any confidence that they could have. This is why me and Kristen do what we do. This is why we go out and we talk about residential school, because we want people to know something happened to us to destroy who we were meant to be. It's time for us to change that. I want to be able to leave a voice on the land that's positive for the generations that are still to come. and know that they have a culture and tradition that they can be proud of. But it takes more than just one voice. You've heard the term, it takes a community to raise a child. We need everybody to come together. We need everybody to stand beside each other, to hold each other up, and learn how to share. When you come into a circle like this, you build trust, and you build respect for each other. When that starts to happen, I think healing will happen too. I'm 55 years old. I want to be able to I'd love to be able to hold my children and tell them I love them and tell them I'm sorry. For not talking sooner about what happened to me as a child, so that people can understand what changed me. Kristen and I made a video for Orange Shirt Day to talk about intergenerational trauma. And my family heard about it and they watched it. It's the first time in 50 years my family has ever got together to talk about what happened to us when we were children. My oldest sister finally told her husband that she's a residential school survivor. And her daughter was shattered. She said, you know, if you had told me this a long time ago, it would have made a difference for me. Would have made it easy for me to cope with who I am, with the life that I had to witness. Because my whole family grew up in a world of alcoholism and violence. Now my nephews and my nieces are starting to understand, and they're having conversations in their house for the first time. This is what I hope for. This is why me and Kristen go from community to community, organization to organization, and we go to schools and we talk to children about residential schools and the effects of residential school and how it affects not just our families, but the community around us. Many of us have been judged for the survivors of residential school who came home and created hell in the communities. And now everybody's saying, oh, those guys are assholes, lazy, welfare bums. It's not true. I wish I had the courage to speak a long time ago. Today I'm filled with gratitude that Kristen asked me to work with her and bring awareness about residential school. Because this is a truth that people need to hear. Yes, it's horrific. Yes, it's painful. Yes, it's really dark. It'll cause tears. It'll shake your world. But you need to hear this truth. You need to see me the way I am. I don't want to paint a pretty picture of Eddy Charlie working on Orange Shirt Day, going out in the community and talking to people about residential school. I want you to know what it was like before I came here today. I was a drunk. And I wasn't just like 3 to 4 beer drunk. No, I drank until I was like fall down drunk and I couldn't remember anything the next day. During these stages, I hurt people. I want you to know that. Because it's not just me that was going out there hurting people. It's still happening. Could be my nephews, my nieces, my cousins' children. They felt our pain. They felt the pain of our parents and our grandparents. And they're acting it out now in our place. I want to teach people what happened to us so they could stop that violence, stop that hurt. Somebody up here spoke about bringing culture back. I find that to be one of the most important phrases ever for me. I see kids out there drumming and singing. I see kids out there dancing with powwow regalia. I see children out there learning about their language. And these children are the most successful and happy people in our community right now. This is something I want to see happen more all across Canada. This is the reason why I agreed to work with Kristen about bringing awareness of residential school to the community. But I wanted you to see me. I wanted you to see the person under here. I wanted you to see the anger. I wanted you to see the pain. I wanted you to see the aggression. I want you to know that before today, I was a really nice man. And there are still many people out there suffering. I'm filled with gratitude at this opportunity to work on Orange Shirt Day. It's part of Phyllis Webstad's story. But I want people to know about it everywhere. Me and Kristen made friends with politicians all over Canada with one goal of bringing awareness not just to Victoria but all across Canada. And then it's happening. This year at Orange Shirt Day, Premier John Horgan declared that British Columbia is recognizing September 30th as Orange Shirt Day, and they wrote up a proclamation to state that is happening. Because one small group of people getting together can make a difference. And I'm really filled with gratitude that I'm gifted with this opportunity to use my voice. I want people to hear my truth. This truth is not very beautiful, but when it starts to become shared, it can make a real difference in the community. It can make a real difference for the generations that are coming after us. We always talk about reconciliation. Why act of reconciliation for me is allowing you to see my hurt, allowing you to share my tears, and allowing you to share your tears with me. That's the first stage of building trust. When we learn how to trust each other, the circle's going to keep on growing and growing. I wished I had used my voice a long time ago. I wished I had the courage to share what happened to me as a child. But I was too ashamed to tell people that somebody was doing something to me in the residential school. I think it's the only reason why nobody in any of the communities across Canada talk about it too, because they're too ashamed. Here's hoping Orange that they will bring change to that. I want to say thank you to everybody for allowing me to speak here today. This has been one of the most painful journeys for me. But it's also been one of the most inspiring journeys for me too. Because I see schools all across British Columbia having Orange Shirt Day now. I see classrooms talking about residential schools. We have a teacher sitting in the back over there, a good friend of Kristen's. She works at Cedar Hill. And the students talk about residential school more than we know. So I just want to say I raise my hands to you for allowing me to speak to you today. I raise my hands to you for those of you who shared your tears with me today. That meant more to me. That meant a lot to me. It's people like you that inspire me. My name is Eddy Charlie. I'm from Couch Nation. Hi, Scott CM.
One more thing I'd like to share is the story behind the design, because I think it's always a reminder to Eddy and myself of our friendship and the hope for relationships in this land. A good friend of ours who was a classmate, Bear Horn from Sayout Nation, he watched Eddy and I in the journey of creating ceremony with Camosun College in 2015. And we just had orange shirts and a sticker that says, "Every child matters." And so just before our second school ceremony in 2016, Bear approached Eddy and myself and said that he had had a vision and he was thinking about our friendship, and this was the vision that he had of the bear and the eagle, the hummingbirds and the flowers. And if we wanted to use it in efforts for Orange Shirt Day, that we would be welcome to do so. And he's given permission to share about his design. Nobody says it quite like he does, but I always try. And it's also written in some of our brochures that the bear is to help us find a good path, and the eagle is to help us have a bright vision and hope for the future. And the hummingbirds is for heart, mind, body and spirit, they're messengers. And that the flowers, they help bring all of these elements together in harmony and unison. So thank you again for hearing us.
I'm going to sing the traveling song now, and this song has a very strong spiritual meaning behind it. And this song is not only for safe travels of those on the living world, but it is also for the safe travels of those who have passed on.
A very powerful moment. I encourage our audience to just take a moment and put both feet on the ground and take a very cleansing breath. We asked Aurora to come up after Eddy's story to just provide a little bit of space for a little bit of healing. Stories like Eddy's take a lot of courage to tell. They take a lot of courage to listen to as well. And Eddy, I hold my hands up to you all the time for your courage to come back over and over again to share your story. You know, one of the things that Eddy said, he says that when we look at some of the traumas we've experienced in our lives as Indigenous people and some of the forms of violence, each of those instances takes just a little bit out of our book. And I believe very strongly that our ability to be able to tell our story and to participate in healing puts just a little bit back, a little bit more in our book. So thank you, Eddy, for your courage. Our stories like Eddy's are our histories, they're our legacies. And it's important to keep those stories, those histories, and those legacies alive. Our next speaker is going to talk a little bit about what the stories sound like in the criminal justice system. My friend and my colleague, Dr. Jane Dickson, who I have a very deep respect for, she's a professor at Carlton University. She is also an instructor with the Indigenous Perspectives Society in the Gladue training program. Dr. Dickson and I met a few years ago. We were introduced through somebody that we both knew, and we started developing this Gladue Writers program, and Dr. Dickson will tell you a little bit more about that. We've successfully launched 3 cohorts. Dr. Dickson is a very well-respected scholar and researcher. She's authored more than 70 Gladue reports, and she was also an evaluator for the Saskatchewan Legal Aid Gladue pilot project. I know it's a mouthful, and she'll be able to tell you a little bit more about that. But Dr. Dickson, again, it's my pleasure. Please, I welcome you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here. I've come from Ottawa, from the unceded Algonquin territory, to this warm and welcome from the Esquimalt and Songhees people on whose land we are now standing. I'm going to take the time that we have together today to tell you a story. And you may be wondering, what do stories have to do with criminal justice? Well, I can tell you that in my path to this point, what I have learned is that there are no places where stories do not belong. Every one of us has a story, and our stories are sacred. They are the true currency that we bring to ourselves and into our legacy as we move through life. And at the end of it all, when everything else falls away, it is that story that we leave. And when our children tell it, and our children's children tell it, and their children's children, for over all the generations, we live again through that story. I want to start by telling you a story. It's not my story. And in some ways, it's not a particularly remarkable or interesting story, because all of our stories are remarkable and interesting. But in other ways, it's a very important story, because it is the story that launched 1,000 others. And that is the story of Jamie Gladue. We come into Jamie's life at a time that should have been one of the best. She was 19 years old, it was her birthday. And her partner Reuben and her family and friends had gathered around her to celebrate this milestone in her life. It was a good party. And, you know, as parties often are, people were singing and dancing, and some people were drinking. Some people were drinking too much. Jamie and Reuben's relationship wasn't perfect. There had been problems. Reuben had a tendency to be unfaithful, and that infidelity had caused much hardship and much conflict between Jamie and Reuben. And on that special night, on her 19th birthday, Jamie found herself confronted once more by her partner's unfaithfulness. They fought, and their anger rang out across the community. And fueled by hurt and alcohol, the fight turned violent. Jamie stabbed Reuben in the back as he left his house. She was arrested. She was taken before the courts, and she pled guilty to manslaughter, and she was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Jamie appealed that sentence. She appealed it all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. And she was able to appeal that sentence because of a set of changes to the sentencing laws in the Canadian Criminal Code that had taken place in 1996. 3 years before Jamie's case would be heard by the Supreme Court of Canada. The changes to the criminal code regarding sentencing were greatly informed by the restorative justice principles that were very much in vogue in that period of time. Restorative approaches that focused on healing, rehabilitation, and restoration were central to the changes that the Government of Canada wanted to make to sentencing. There was a strong belief at that time that no one benefits from going to prison. Prison harms those we place in the cells. It harms those people leave behind in their communities. And in many cases, especially in the case of Indigenous peoples, that is merely one more harm, one more act of violence visited upon families and individuals who are struggling with remarkable measures of historical trauma effects, and intergenerational effects. So the Government of Canada changed the sentencing rules. They changed the sentencing rules to focus on those restorative principles and gave direct instruction to the courts to stop putting people in jail whenever there was any other viable alternative available. That direction was contained in a section of the Criminal Code at Section 718(2)(e). And Section 718(2)(e) directed courts across the country to consider all reasonable alternatives to imprisonment whenever they were sentencing anyone, but especially when they were sentencing an Indigenous person. And to inform that process and guide that search for alternatives was to be attention to the unique background and circumstances of Indigenous people and how that unique background and those circumstances may have contributed to bringing that person before the court, facing a sentence for a criminal act. So Jamie came before the court less than a year after those sentencing changes came into effect. When she stood before the court, her lawyer didn't acknowledge her indigeneity. The Crown didn't seem too concerned about it, but the judge caught it. He got that one part right. He asked Jamie if she was Indigenous, and she said yes, that she was Cree. She was from Alberta. He asked a few more questions, and what he learned was that Jamie was living off reserve, and indeed had lived off reserve for most of her life, as do nearly 70% of Canada's Indigenous population. And reflecting on that, the judge said, oh, well, you know, she doesn't live on a reserve, so there's really nothing uniquely Indigenous about her background. There's nothing uniquely Indigenous about her circumstances, so I don't need to worry about that Section 718(2)(e) stuff. It just doesn't apply. A remarkable statement, implying that somehow indigeneity is a cloak that you take off when you leave the reserve and enter non-reserve territory. Like it's something you can leave behind. Like it's something that doesn't shape every moment of every day of your life and how you see the lives of those around you. So Jamie's lawyer appealed that decision, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. And in 1999, the Supreme Court of Canada, in a case known in law as Regina versus Gladue, laid out what we now know as the Gladue requirements. Those requirements demand that any court before which an Indigenous person is standing, facing a possible loss of liberty, must hear that person's story. In this moment, that practice, that requirement, sets us apart from every other country in the world. In Canada, the law requires that Indigenous stories are heard in the courtroom. Now the next question is, what does that have to do with reconciliation? Right? Criminal justice is still about cops and courts and corrections, putting people in jail, holding them to standards that don't always make sense, defined by rules that we don't always even know about. How do those stories, how do those Indigenous stories impact reconciliation? Well, they impact reconciliation because now judges are a captive audience. They're required to hear these stories. They're required to know and understand this person standing before them, and to consider that story in assessing the moral blameworthiness of that individual for the choices that he or she has made and the harms that those choices have caused, and in many cases, harms that have been caused to another Indigenous person. How does that information get before the court? Well, that information gets before the court, ideally in the form of a full Gladue report. A full Gladue report, written by someone who has been trained to write a Gladue report, will contain the history of the individual over 3 generations, from immediate to parents to grandparents. It will trace the story of all those generations down to the present. It will be balanced. It will include both the good and the bad that has characterized that pathway. It will talk about community, culture, resilience, power, all of the positive things that go along with being Indigenous. It will also talk about residential schools. It will talk about loss of land through unfulfilled treaties. It will talk about the 60s scoop. It will talk about the fact that today there are more Indigenous children in care in this country than were in residential schools at the height of that policy. It will talk about trauma. It will talk about intergenerational effects. But it will do so in a way which respects the Indigenous person who is before the court, the story that they have lived, and try to assist them to locate a healing path going forward. The second part of the report builds upon that history, explains the healing needs left in the wake of that history, and addresses those needs through a series of sentencing options, programs, healing interventions. It may be time with elders, it may be time on the land, it may be addictions treatment, it may be counseling, it may be any number of things, but what we hope it is not is prison. A full Gladue report is the best way to tell that story. But I must tell you, full Gladue reports are very thin on the ground in this country. In many places across Canada, the ability for an Indigenous person before the court to have their story told fully, completely, and well through a Gladue report is very unlikely. The reality is that in some of the areas of this country where the largest populations of Indigenous people live, there is not a single Gladue writer. In the Northwest Territories, where 90% of the people who come before the court are Indigenous, there is no Gladue writer. In Newfoundland, Labrador, there is no Gladue writer. When you move south, your chances get a little better. But the reality is that there are too few writers for far too many reports. And the most common way that the Gladue information comes before the court is through a standard pre-sentence report containing some Gladue considerations or oral submissions, usually by defense counsel, sometimes reasonably well researched, reasonably well stated, oftentimes neither of those things. How has this happened? How is this possible? These requirements are the law. Why are we not hearing more Indigenous stories in the courtroom? Well, I think there are many reasons. There are many reasons that include issues like resources, adequate policies. At this point in time, we don't really have any clarity around those reasons. I'm running a national research project on Gladue right now. We're talking to judges. We're talking to people who write and research reports. We're talking to policymakers to try and find out why Indigenous stories are not a bigger part of our system. We need to do better than we're doing now. Indigenous Perspectives Society, myself, and Royal Roads University have partnered to train the best Gladue writers in the country. And we have quite a large number of graduates who are writing reports in many places across Canada. But their work is hard. It is demanding. And there is never enough time to research all the stories that need to be told and to ensure that they come before the court in the best manner possible. Gladue was intended to be remedial. Gladue was intended to reduce the number of Indigenous people languishing behind bars in this country. In the early 1990s, when Parliament was debating the changes to the criminal code that have given us Gladue, Indigenous people comprised roughly 3 to 4% of the Canadian population. But at that time, they comprised almost 17% of the federally incarcerated prison population. The percentages in provincial and territorial institutions were much higher. Those numbers were sufficient to compel Parliament to make changes to the code and require that courts pay direct attention to Indigenous stories. And now here we are, 20 years later. The Indigenous population of Canada is now higher, absolutely. But today, 1 in every 3 federally sentenced women is Indigenous. 1 in every 4 federally sentenced men is Indigenous. 43% of youth offenders who are girls are sitting in institutions and are Indigenous. 43%, almost half of the young women we are warehousing in prison are Indigenous. Over 30% of the young boys that we warehouse in prisons are Indigenous. We are failing to get these stories to the courts. The courts want to hear these stories. They know they need to hear these stories. And we must find a way to get those stories to the court. Because again, ultimately, all any of us are is our stories. Our stories are sacred. Our stories deserve to be told, and they deserve to be told well. That is the role, the function, and the honor of Gladue. And that is a role that we can all play. Thank you very much. That was bound to happen at some point.
Thank you, Jane. A very mesmerizing storyteller. Thank you, Dr. Dickson. Our next panelist is appearing by video. Laurie McDonald is an elder with the Enoch Cree Nation. He's also an instructor with the Indigenous Perspectives Society, has been for 8 years. He is a long-time educator, spent a lot of years in child welfare. He's also the founder of the Greater Vancouver Cultural Society for Two-Spirit People. And it's unfortunate that he couldn't be here this evening in person. When we talk about reconciliation, it's incredibly important to consider the perspective of Two-Spirit people with residential school and with colonization. I'm moving back to the center of the stage. Thank you, Jason, and my apologies. With colonization and residential schools, it not only shamed homosexuality, but it also enforced binary genders. And I apologize because I am being told that I need to have the mic closer to my face so that I can be heard. I'm going to invite those of you in the room to just turn to your right to look at the screen, and we're going to hear words from Laurie McDonald, Two-Spirited Elder from the Enoch Cree Nation. Thank you.
Hi, I'm H.G. Watson with Daily Extra. Over the last several years, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada has been traveling across the country collecting the accounts of First Nation survivors of residential schools. This week in Toronto, they're making their first hearings for people that are two-spirited, who experienced residential schools in a way that was very unique.
My name is Laurie McDonald. I am Neheo. Neheo means people of the four directions. I just come in from Victoria, British Columbia, but I'm originally from the Enoch First Nation in Alberta.
Right. And you're here in Toronto for the next few days to tell your story at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I was wondering why you decided that you wanted to make the journey to tell your story.
I actually did tell my story to the Truth and Reconciliation maybe about, I think it was about 6-7 years ago. And but in telling your story, we tell our stories as survivors. And as survivors, it's fine, because we talk about what does our story consist of. Our story can consist of, yes, we were abused. Yes, we were physically abused. Yes, we were sexually abused. Yes, we were a product of neglect. But the one thing that was missing in this whole process of the settlement was that they overlooked the fact that we as two-spirited people were unique in a sense. Yes, we had the same abuse system, but when you're a two-spirited person, all too often, if you come from a traditional background, and you know who you are, and when you go into these schools, you actually become somebody that's a prey. You're preyed upon, even though you're 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. For me, I come from a background where this was normal for us to be two-spirited people and to have those personalities, because we walked into those two worlds. But when you went into this school, what the adjudicators and the commission fail to realize from our perspective is that our abuse was probably much more severe.
What age did you end up going to a residential school?
For me, I was fortunate, and I say fortunate. I went to the Ermineskin Residential School, and I always make this, I would have been about 10 or 11. And the year I was there, I put it in my pack sack for so many years, but I brought it out when I made it in comparison. What year did John Kennedy get shot? 1962. So this would have been 1962, 63, I believe. But this is when I would relate to this being my second year in there. So I would have been about 10.
Right. And how long were you in the school?
I was in the school for 6 years.
Right. I read in a newspaper article in the Victoria Observer, I believe it was, that you felt that you had to go underground when you were in the school. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
It's exactly what I just told you.
Yeah.
When we say we had to go underground, is that, because I come from a background, as I said, where for me, to walk in two worlds was normalized. My family, my parents, my grandmother knew who I was and what my role. It's all about a role that is given to you when you're very little. And some people and some First Nation organizations, some First Nation people say it's like they compare it to the bow in the basket, meaning that if you, when you're little, if you gravitated to the basket, that was your role, be it what it was. If you gravitated to the bow, that would depict that's what the Creator had picked for you, as to be that hunter, as opposed to being the picker. So for me, and I say I come from a traditional background, I had all those tools impacted me, and I was taught that role. But once you went into the school, without trying to be obvious, because obvious, there were feminine traits in me, but for me to say to go underground, I had to hide who I was.
Now I understand that you're an educator and that you've been working as well with First Nations children and other two-spirited children. What role do you think that this commission is playing? Like, do you feel that it's helping to rebuild some of those connections, or what makes it important for you?
Well, I'm looking at the process for the commission and the commissioners and what their mandate was, and they've accomplished what they carried out the agreement that was settled for them, but they hadn't finished yet. Because when I say they haven't finished yet, they hadn't dealt with our particular segment. For me as an educator, and I have right now, I'm an adult instructor for Aboriginal social workers, and part of that process of them is to be educated about the residential school and the effects, and talk about the truth and reconciliation, and to explain to them, yes, reconciliation is part of a big package here. Yes, we've gotten through this level, but for me, as a person talking about reconciliation, a little bit. Yeah. It's got a long way to go yet. And I think it might help for me, reconciliation might be a little higher now, a little step higher, in the fact that, yes, the commissioner is listening to the Two-Spirit community, because our story is different.
I want to thank you so much for sharing your story with us today.
All right.
I wish Laurie were here in person so that we could say thank you, but he's certainly with us in spirit. And again, I apologize to the room and to our guests online that I need to be constantly reminded to bring the mic up to a little bit closer to my face. We heard Laurie McDonald talk about his experience as a two-spirit person. Our next performer, a very talented Métis, Eddy Wilson, is going to share his experiences through art. He's going to do a movement piece that incorporates modernized elements of their culture. So I welcome Eddy Wilson to the stage. Thank you so much, Eddy. What a powerful, very powerful messages and a very powerful presentation. We're moving right along into our evening. For those of you online, again, thank you for continuing to join us. And those of you in the room, we are moving on to our last speaker. I'm taking note that we didn't get a question and answer period from Dr. Jane Dickson, but for those of you who do have questions, you will have an opportunity this evening. And of course, our audience online also has the opportunity to put questions in the chat box. Our last speaker of the evening, I thought perhaps I was supposed to dance there. Our last speaker of the evening, Charlie Marie Batchelor, 16 years old, Montagnais, also West Indian. She's a high school student here in Victoria, British Columbia, a very talented public speaker. I describe Charlie as educationally provocative. She often speaks out looking at reforms in the educational system as it pertains to Aboriginal education, Indigenous education in the educational system, and has been a voice and an advocate since elementary school. It is my pride, it is also my honor to invite Charlie Marie Batchelor to the stage.
Hello, bonjour, Anine. My name is Charlie Batchelor. I'm happy to be here, and I just wanted to take a moment to thank IPS and Stream of Consciousness for hosting this event. As you can clearly tell, me being up on the stage, that it is important to people of all ages, including youth. I'm going to speak about the call to action for education in Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Report and its impact and importance in my life. I have the understanding that there are some SD62 reps in the audience tonight, and I just wanted to thank you for coming and hearing me speak. One term you will hear me say a lot during this presentation is ABED, A-B-E-D, which stands for Aboriginal Education. The report says to provide the necessary funding to Aboriginal schools to utilize Indigenous knowledge and teaching methods in classrooms, developing and implementing kindergarten to grade 12 curriculum and learning resources on Aboriginal peoples in Canada, history and legacy of residential schools. That is in no way all of the report's calls to action for education, but those are only the ones that are important to what I'm going to speak of today. So the ADBED program in place currently in my secondary school provides Orange Shirt Day. They do teaching in classrooms for non-Aboriginal students and for Aboriginal students. There has been a recent edition of Focus Blocks in my school, and during those Focus Blocks they host workshops and teachings. They serve traditional tea once a week and the importance behind those teas. They help all students with classwork throughout the school as need be. They have events for and teachings for staff such as smudging and food. And there are support for students who know that the program is in place. In my experience, there have been a few things that haven't worked through the report. For example, most Aboriginal students don't know that our ABED program is in place, or they don't know who the teachers are, where the room is, or what supports they have access to. I'd like to share a few stories regarding some of my struggles that I've had through the educational system about my culture. So in third grade, I was presented with a project on Christopher Columbus and what his accomplishments were. And the project called to talk about his ships, where he had been, and what he had done. Me being a very outspoken and well-educated 8-year-old, rather than talking about his so-called accomplishments, I talked about rather the mass genocide, rape, violence, disease, guns, and the just all-around tragedy of his voyages to Canada and the United States. And I received a C on the project, although it was very well done, if I do say so myself. Because my teacher claimed it was bias, false, and not what the project called for. I know. In grade 4, I had a new AdBed teacher come into the school, and it had been a few months and I hadn't seen him, so my mother called in to see what was going on. And he claimed that because he was so spread out between so many schools, that he only met with Aboriginal students with behavioral and learning issues. And obviously that's not what the ABED program is in place for. My high school experience has been much different as the report, the Truth and Reconciliation report came into place 2015, the year I moved to high school. However, there have still been some gaps in my cultural learning, such as lack of cultural opportunity through my AdBed program, as I've been in high school for 3 years and no programs have come to my class so far. Even though I'm one of the AdBed students, I tried to attend a smudge in my school and I was told that it was only for teachers and that I wasn't allowed to participate. We used to have an AdBed lunch program in middle school where there would be pizza sometimes and traditional snacks. We would watch documentaries, do drumming, singing, all the things that were important to our culture, but there is no program like that in place in high school. And once a week I serve tea to non-Aboriginal students. I volunteer, but there is nothing in place for me to partake in my own culture. All things aside, there are some things that SD 62 does very well. They are really good at recruiting AdBed teachers. I've been in the program for 12 years and I've never had a teacher that I didn't like. I've had my current AdBed teacher for 6 years and they are one of my biggest supports and my favorite teacher. In middle school, the AdBed program was my favorite part of school because it was a place where my culture was accepted in an environment where it might not have been understood by the other students. As a result of all the things I've just said, I do have a few recommendations for the school districts. I think that there should be lunch programs in place in all schools for all grades, regardless of attendance. I was told that because of lack of attendance and participation in these programs, that they couldn't host them anymore. But personally, I don't think that the school districts are in a position to say where even if one student wants to attend, that the program is a waste or invalid if it's going to change that experience for one student. I believe that the AdBed teachers should target classes with AdBed students in them to do their teachings. And I believe that an Aboriginal guidance counselor would be highly useful. I was recently in the hospital, and although they were treating me medically, we had to bring in an Aboriginal social worker in order for me to be able to leave my room because the medical system didn't really understand that in order for people to thrive, you need to feed their mind, body, and spirit. And I find that the education system is very similar, that they're very focused on one aspect, and that an Aboriginal guidance counselor for Aboriginal students would make all the difference. I suggest that that the school districts use the teachers for what they are paid to do. So, meaning to help AdBed students and all AdBed students in whatever they might need, and more events and cultural opportunities. As far as I know, there is 2 events, one at the beginning of the year and one in February for the entire school district. And then there are the occasional salmon bakes in our school and servings of tea, like I said, but there's nothing consistent in place as far as I know. And I just wanted to leave an opportunity for anyone who might have had a question. And if there is no one and you think of one later, you feel free to approach me. And thank you so much for listening to what I had to say. Thank you, merci, miigwech haichka.
So I'm going to get Charlie Marie to stay on stage. I'm also going to ask Dr. Jane Dickson to come back to the stage with Eddy and Kristen so that we can give the room an opportunity to ask questions. I believe that we have a microphone that may be going around. There will be one going around. So please, if you have a question, just raise your hand. And in the interim, Dr. Dickson, Eddy, Kristen, if I could ask you to come back to the stage. Thank you. Come on up. I'm going to move this so that it doesn't land up under somebody's feet again. I'm going to move off stage, but I'll give you that to move back. Are there questions in the audience?
I have a question for Eddy Charlie. Yeah.
Picking on me.
Ah. Well, I have two questions for you. Firstly, 21 years ago, what happened for you to change?
So 21 years ago, what happened to turn things for change for you, stopping drinking?
I spoke to you about some of the things that were making me angry. A lot of the anger was pretty much at the highest point of that it could reach 21 years ago. And I had a friend that I met when I was 16 years old. I moved to Vancouver when I was only 14. And I thought being away from home, away from family violence, that my drinking would stop. But it actually went up a couple of notches. And I met this young man there who became one of the best friends I ever had. And, 21 years ago, I beat the crap out of him. And I beat him up so bad that he had to have 3 reconstructive surgeries on his face. And I did not know that I beat up my friend. I just woke up in jail one day and there was blood all over my hands and my shirt. And the cop let me go. And they said they didn't want to let me go because what I did was so bad. And I was going home and I bumped into my friend's wife. And she told me what I did. And I hit rock bottom. I really hated myself at that time. I beat up one of the best friends I ever had. This is a person that loved me more than my own family did. And I beat him up so bad. So I packed up and left town. And that was the beginning of my journey to finding the sober path that I walk today. And I'm really sad to see that it took something that bad for me to want to find the sober path that I walk today.
Thank you. And then my other question is, I went to school, I'm a little older than you are, and there were Indigenous kids in our school. They didn't all go to residential school. How did they pick and choose, or who went and who didn't go? And
He's saying that he's around your age and remembers having Indigenous children in his schooling, so not everyone went to residential school. How did they pick and choose who went to school and who didn't?
I really have no clue.
yeah,
I think, I don't know. I just remember that when I was 4 years old, I peeked in my window and saw my grandparents drumming and singing. But I do remember that there was a car outside our place too, and we never had a car before. So I'm assuming that people from the government, perhaps the church, came to visit us and just chose survivors that went to residential school already and chose their children and took them, but I'm not sure. I can't honestly answer that question.
Yeah, I was not even aware there were residential schools when I was in school, and there were residential schools. You know, I didn't know it happened. And I've since learned of this in the last 20 or 30 years, but not in the last 40 or 50. Nobody talked about it. It was a non-event kind of. So it's just a question. Thank you.
I have a question for Kristen. No. Sorry, what was your name? Jade. Hi. I'm wondering if you know how extensive and accessible the training is to become a Gladue writer and what some of the requirements might be.
Okay, well, our training runs over 10 weeks. I don't like this because I tripped over it. I know it's trying to kill me, so I want to keep my distance. The training that we offer runs over 10 weeks. It has 5 modules to it. So the first module is cultural background, cultural training. It also is a module that begins the journey walking through the system, how the criminal justice system works. Then we walk through the second module that talks about the trial process and sentencing and what's involved. Then we move into a discussion of the current law around Gladue, how to research and write reports using trauma-informed approaches and practices. And the final module actually walks you through the writing of a Gladue report. We feel the training is very accessible. We have a wide range of students in the training. We have students who are community people, who have a great deal of relevant work experience. They may not have post-secondary education, all the way through to people who are in law school, people who have master's degrees. And the feedback we get quite uniformly is that all those people from all that kind of different educational background find the training to be very accessible and very relevant to the kind of change that they want to engage. So it's a demanding training. It reflects best practices. It's a training model that I would like to see emulated across the country because it reflects some of the really important pragmatic issues around writing for the courts, right? So the training is accessible. You can come to it from a wide range of backgrounds, and most of the people that we have trained are now writing reports. So it's very rewarding work.
Thank you. I just would like to ask if you foresee the ability to open up the training, a percentage that is not cost barriered for individuals.
Yeah,
you do? Okay.
Yeah, we do offer spots
Okay.
that we call them scholarship spots, but yeah, we make the training accessible to people who can't pay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I had a couple of comments for Eddy and a question. First comment is that I applaud you for sharing your story. Like, I didn't go to residential school. I'll answer the gentleman's question there a little bit. I'm a little older than you. I traveled down on the caravans from Prince Rupert through to Prince George, ended up in a parking lot in Abbotsford, 13 years old, and didn't have a clue of who I was going to stay with. And I think they just picked random kids and said, you're going with that family, and the rest of you are going to Allert Bay or Port Alberni. And some of the kids that came down with us were 5, 6 years old. And we were like, the babysitters all the way down. And I always ask people, like, you talk about your anger and that. I haven't been able to speak up and talk because that anger is just too ugly sometimes. But I always ask people, how many of you have 5-year-old kids, 6-year-old, 7, 8-year-old kids? Would you give them to us for 8 years and let us beat the English out of them? Send them home for, July and August every year? Think about that, because that's the experience I had. And I really applaud you for telling your story, Eddy. And I was thinking, since you're such good friends with John Horgan, the province...
He's saying, since you're such good friends with John Horgan.
The province collects $2 billion a year from property transfer tax on land that they don't hold the underlying title to. Every time someone gets up and says, the unceded land of so-and-so, they're basically saying, okay, the province doesn't have a treaty for any of these lands. Very few, maybe 10% of the land in BC. Ask John Horgan if he can take that $2 billion and start putting it towards infrastructure for First Nations communities without any preconditions on treaty, and upgrading education for Native people and health services. So that's a challenge that I'm putting to you.
share later. It was a comment and feedback.
Charlie, right? Thank you for sharing your story. My question is, as a non-Indigenous educator, what advice can you give for allyship and for us non-Indigenous educators in terms of your perspective as a student, please?
That is a big question. I would say that most, but not all, I've found Aboriginal students have very different ways of learning, one of which stories that my mother reminded me of not too long before presenting was that on my very first day of high school, my very first class was my grade 9 science class, and our teacher took us out for a walk, and we had to do a project on what we saw in the environment and the effects of modernism and all those things, and I thought it was absolutely the coolest class ever. And my mother later pointed out to me that that's probably in correlation with Aboriginal people have a very close connection to the land. Back before residential school, before colonization, everything, the land gave us absolutely everything we needed, and we were so spiritually connected to it. And that definitely transferred down through generations. And it's very closely connected to what I was saying about feeding the mind, spirit, and body, and that I found that the new curriculum definitely does add in elements of this, but in my personal opinion, I think there could be a little bit more of it where you're not just sitting in a classroom, you're not just feeding children and teenagers information constantly on paper and through computers, but that you're actually going out into the world and experiencing things, especially through things like science classes, where I just don't understand why you can't see the things you're learning about when it's right outside the building.
You can take your seats. Thank you. Thank you, all of you. Thank you. To all of the speakers and the performers, I want to again extend my deepest gratitude for the time that you take, the courage that it took to be here tonight, your creativity, and for sharing your energy with us. As we close up our night, I think one of the things that comes to mind that I'd like to share is my father was René Dallaire, and he attended residential school in Ontario. He attended St. Alfred's, and when he was in residential school, the system looked very different. The system was a place where abuse was rampant, and the system that he experienced was very different than the child welfare system that I experienced decades later when he wasn't able to care for me, and then I went into the child welfare system. Now, while the child welfare system, when I was in it, was less than perfect, it was certainly better than the system that René Dallaire was raised in. And when I look at the circles that I walk in today, especially in Indigenous child welfare, the system is still far from perfect, but it's different and better in some ways than it was when I was in the child welfare system, and certainly when René Dallaire was in the child welfare system. And I think that the reason why I want to share this is that when it comes to change, it's people like yourselves, it's people like our guests online, and it's forums such as these that provide the venues for dialogue that inspire change. And on that note, I really want to encourage you, for those of you who are non-Indigenous, for those of you who are allies in this room, to consider what is it that you can do today, this month, this year? What is it that you can reasonably commit to? And one of the things that I task you with is taking the responsibility of sharing the messages and the energy and the tears that we shared in this room tonight. And for those of you online as well, please take the responsibility to share some of that information. For those of you online, you can receive this by email, and we will send it to you. But for those of you in the room, you're going to find that on the table to my right, there's a pile of paper, and one of the print-offs that's there for you to take as a takeaway tonight, it's called the Ally Bill of Responsibility, and it's quite lengthy. I'm not going to read it, but I encourage you to pick up a copy and to read ways that you can be an ally. Don't act out of guilt, Be comfortable being secondary when working with Indigenous peoples. Educate yourself, know your own ancestral history, and be comfortable with it. There are a number of ways that allies can work and support the very important work that we did here tonight. Again, I thank you all. I wish everyone a very good night and safe travels home, wherever home may be. I know that we have some folks visiting from out of town. Miigwech, all my relations. Thank you.